Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of exponential technologies, business innovation, entrepreneurship, thought leadership, enterprise IT security, neuroscience, philosophy, personal development, and more. Welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is Bill Murphy, your host of the Red Zone podcast. I'm super excited about having some of the guests on recently that have just been, for me, exponential insights into world-changing ideas and some of the best leaders in the world at innovation. And I'm super happy that you're able to listen to being a fly on the wall to my conversation with the best of the best. And today will not disappoint you. My guest is Rita McGrath. She is a best-selling author and a sought-after speaker and a longtime professor at Columbia Business School. She's widely recognized as a premier expert on strategy, innovation, entrepreneurship, and growth in times of exponential change and uncertainty. She's received the #1 Achievement Award for strategy from the prestigious Thinkers 50. I mean, Google that. Thinkers 50 is amazing. I also have a link to a book. It's a free book called, I think it's a Chief Strategy Officer, and it's wonderful. And she's been consistently named as one of the world's top 10 management thinkers in its biannual ranking. As a consultant to CEOs, her work has had a lasting impact on strategy and growth programs of the Fortune 500 companies worldwide. She is highly sought after as a speaker at exclusive corporate events around the globe, such as the Global Peter Drucker Forum. She's also the author of several books, including the best-selling book, The End of Competitive Advantage, and her new book, Seeing Around Corners. I love that title, Seeing Around Corners, How to Spot Inflection Points in Business Before They Happen. And she's written 3 other books, notably Discovery-Driven Growth, cited by Clayton Christensen, the amazing Clayton Christensen, as creating one of the most important management ideas ever developed. She's received her PhD from Wharton School at UPenn and has degrees with honors from Barnard College and the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. So what are you going to get out of this conversation? What you're going to get is you're going to understand a couple of key things. Well, certainly some interesting stories like Walmart, how Walmart, a behemoth, a massive giant, innovated in response to a restrictive culture. I mean, they tried and they tried and they tried, but how did Walmart finally out-innovate itself? And how to see around corners. You know, this general thesis that Rita has, how do we see around corners? And that's important. And she gives some practical ideas on how to do that. We talk about the red box strategy used by a successful innovator, Adobe. And we talk about Rita's superpower when she's working with organizations. And then how to navigate inflection points personally. How do you bring innovation to an organization where you haven't personally been pushing the envelope with your own innovation and your own psyche? And then how retail will rebound. Again, we learn and we're sucked into the media talking about how retail is dying. Well, how will retail rebound? What are some successes that we're seeing right now? And then snow melts from the edge. And so how, as an organization, do you scale and sense and touch your organizations where that snow is melting and where there's potential disruption happening so that you can plan as a leader to innovate and to react to that before it disrupts the organization? And then finally, how innovation, proficiency, defangs an organization's antibodies. I love that. Innovation, proficiency, defangs an organization's antibodies. I love that. So with that, I want to introduce you to this amazing conversation with Rita McGrath. Rita, I want to welcome you to the show today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I love that your book that I just have here in front of me, Seeing Around Corners, How to Spot Inflection Points in Business Before They Happen. And I think sometimes, I see the forward is written by Clayton Christensen, and having a chance to listen to him a couple years ago live in a small setting of about 40 people, it really made me pause and grab the book. So I wanted to I wanted to start off by if you can talk about how did you get into the innovation. I don't want to call it an industry, but you were in innovation probably before it was so popular to be in innovation. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your journey of what were some of your stepping points that got you into this point of being really a world leader in the innovation space.
Well, I think it started really with my first job after graduate school, which was taking manual processes in IT and actually digitizing them. So I didn't think of it as innovation at the time, but it really was. It was working for city government and moving things that had been done a certain way for decades and decades into what we would now think of as the cloud. But that was a long time ago. And then I went back to do my PhD at Wharton and ended up in the Entrepreneurship Center there, working on basically corporate venturing. And the real spark was a grant that we got at Wharton for a 3-year study of innovation at Citibank. And our sponsor there was very interested to know what was it that made the difference between ventures that were successful and ventures that struggled. And so what we did was a very intensive series of case studies of 23 Citibank ventures that, with a mix of successes and failures. And out of that, we called it the City Ventures program. And out of that came a really foundational white paper, which never really got published, but I had a few academic papers come out of it and so forth, but really outlining the very first principles of what allows a corporate venture to succeed as opposed to fail. And it was very, very instructive, and that really was what set me on that path.
It was interesting. I was just in a CIO innovation lunch in Raleigh that we were hosting, and I got a sense that the folks at the table were the CIOs at the table. That some of them were just flat out afraid of voicing what they knew to be true. And when I actually asked the obvious question, the really fear was that they were afraid of either losing their job or afraid of challenging a position. How much of the emotion of fear comes into play with innovation within an organization?
Oh, it's huge. I think, and we've learned this from the seminal work of Amy Edmondson, among other people, who study psychological safety in organizations and teams. And one of the biggest reasons companies have blind spots is because people are afraid to talk about what they see actually going on. And senior leadership a lot of times shuts down those conversations. So it can create a tremendous blind spot.
How about with the generation of ideas? It's interesting. We did some exploration of idea generation. It seems to me that there's no shortage necessarily of ideas that are voiced. It's the execution and testing on the ideas. What is your thoughts on if you were having talking about ideas, what is the challenge between ideas and the testing them and creating a portfolio that can be tested? Is that something that companies struggle with, in your opinion?
Oh, yeah. I think the mythology of innovation is that it's an idea problem that, oh my God, if we just had more good ideas, that would be great. But the real issue is not, between now and lunch, any organization will have 1,000 ideas. That's not the problem. Human beings are very ingenious creatures. We come up with stuff all the time. The real challenge is that bit in the middle, which is how do I decide which are good ideas? Because let's remember, really terrific ideas and really horrible ideas look almost identical at birth. And, you need to recognize that, right? So how do you decide which ones deserve more attention? How do you then, once you've made that decision, how do you get them into some kind of process of experimentation and testing to see whether they are worth spending more time on? How do you then incubate them? And then finally, how do you transition them to this scaling up, moving forward process, which I call acceleration? So, to have a real innovation proficiency, I think you need 3 practices. You need the practice of ideation, indeed generating ideas. Then you need incubation, which spans the journey from let's do some initial experiments all the way through to, okay, we've got something that we feel confident we can take to market. So that's the incubation process. And then you have acceleration, which is taking your little fledgling idea and maturing it so that it can become part of the corporate parent. And that's a completely different phase in the life cycle of an innovation because, frankly, your blank sheet of paper, great ideas people are not necessarily the ones you want designing your supply chain or your compliance processes. It's a different kind of skill set. And so a lot of times in that transition, you need to transition.
So the concept of acceleration you had mentioned, are you saying with most organizations right now, I think sometimes I know within the groups that I am pulling together there, they think that these ideas sometimes have to be these groundbreaking kind of game-changing ideas. And if you kind of had to lump them all together in your experience, would you say that most of the dramatic change can come from internal process type innovation, or is it the net new, the unexplored market? How would you respond to that?
Well, as Clayton Christensen will tell you, there's different kinds of innovation, right? So the vast majority of innovative things basically say, okay, I'm going to take the hammer I used to use one way, and I'm going to make it a better hammer because I'm adding a digital layer to it. Well, the thing about that is it doesn't really create net new growth. What you're doing in that case is you're simply taking something I used to do one way and replacing it with something I used to do another way. So the really groundbreaking innovative ideas are the ones that open up a whole new vector for growth. They solve an entirely new problem or they respond to an entirely new kind of need. And by definition, those are the scarier, riskier ones because they haven't been done before.
So from the seeing around corners part, because that's one of the fundamental parts to your book, which I find interesting. One of my strategic assistant, and we joke about it, but I said, one of your primary job responsibilities is to read my mind. And, and we joke about it. And it was funny. If you don't ask, we definitely won't end up in the universe of possibilities. But I mean, seeing around corners, you had an interesting perspective on that because, you go to these conferences and you always hear about the failures, the Kodaks, the grocery store industry, the pharmacy. You just hear about the constant failure, but then you actually mentioned a couple big wins like DSM and Fujitsu and others, and they must have the ability to see around corners. Is that part of what you're saying?
Well, I think ironically, the successful companies haven't seen around a corner and by and large made a big, huge jump. What you see them doing is a lot of small-scale experimentation and what I call the edges. So one of the chapters in the book is called Snow Melts from the Edges. And the idea there is that the things that are going to be super important for your business don't present themselves neatly at the conference table at headquarters. They happen out, where customers are living or where, your people are sort of reporting that something new is happening in the world or where there's change afoot. And I think the more successful companies are really good at putting some resources and time out there at the edges. And so when a change starts to make itself felt, they're not taken completely by surprise. They've been tracking it all along. And so I think the mythology is that we saw this big change coming and we mobilized an army and we leapt on it. And when you look at how this works in reality, you've got a ton of small scale stuff happening often for a decade or more before the thing actually makes itself felt in your core business.
Do you find that some of those you talk about these different types of decisions, type 1 and type 2 decisions, and I also like the concept of this I had never heard of this kickbox.
Uh-huh.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about that as far as how you see organizations being able to distribute decision making and pull from the edges.
So this was actually a concept that Jeff Bezos talks about. He said, you need to be cognizant that there are type 1 and type 2 decisions. And a type 1 decision is highly risky. It could cause enormous damage if you get it wrong. It's irreversible. It has enormous impact. And that needs to be given tremendous consideration and careful thought. And you really need to have a fair degree of confidence that you know what you're doing. Type 2 decisions, on the other hand, are low risk. They're reversible. So if it doesn't work out, you just stop and go back to what you were doing before. And, it doesn't have huge organizational impact and so on. And he said the problem with large organizations is what happens over time is every single decision gets treated like a type 1 decision. So, you end up having this sort of organizational rigor mortis that sets in because, a request for $50,000 gets treated the same as a request for $50 million. And so you end up with this sort of inability to get things to happen. So I think one of the things that is valuable, I think, is for senior leaders to make a distinction between the two. And then for the type 2 decisions where you really want teams taking initiative and experimenting, how do you now create some kind of vehicle or instrument to make that a reality? And this is where I think Adobe's Kickbox program is so interesting. So anybody in the company can request a Kickbox. It's a little red box, and inside are some instruction manuals, a candy bar, a Starbucks card, a couple of notebooks. But the most important thing in the Kickbox is a $1,000 gift card. And you don't have to ask permission for how you use that $1,000 to conduct a small-scale experiment. The only requirement is that you do the experiment, but then you have to describe what you did and how it worked in their database that they use to sort of track and share these things. And, the CEO was asked, well, God, you give out 1,000 of these things, it's going to cost you $1 million. Isn't that hugely expensive? And first of all, for a company the size of Adobe, no. Secondly, he said, just think about it in terms of, outreach training. You've now got 1,000 people that understand something about innovation. Not that they're necessarily going to have that as their main job, but they at least understand some of the mechanics and how it works. And I think that's just a super interesting approach to fostering this kind of type 2 decision making.
Yeah, it seems like there's a couple thousand ideas that materialize, but maybe 20 to 26 have made it up to the top of the chain, which is probably the right mathematics on it. But it's interesting how they've been able to galvanize, to your point about the snow melts at the edges, it's how they sort of keep their hands on the pulse of the organization at scale. Now, from what you've been brought in your superpower, so to speak, like if you had a primary superpower that you were able to, when you're brought in to either research an organization or to if a team, company's looking for your expertise, where have you been able to really help organizations or individuals within organizations build momentum in this conversation we're having?
Well, I think a couple of things that someone like me can bring to the party are, first of all, I see a lot of organizations. And so you see an awful lot of patterns. And for most corporate people, if they've been in 5, 10 organizations in their entire lives, that's they're very deep in the one or two places they've been, but they don't have that breadth of exposure to lots of industries, lots of companies, lots of different situations that somebody like me would have by virtue of my role, right? I mean, by definition, I'm going to be in contact with dozens of organizations over time. So I think the first thing is that perspective that comes from, here's a set of patterns that I can tap into. I think the second thing that I help with is being able to get that external perspective and that sense of reality that comes from that, which is, here are the assumptions that I see you making. And, as you think about how you make decisions in an organization over time, certain assumptions get taken for granted. They get to be kind of like the air that you breathe, and you don't really think about them anymore. So one of the things I can do is say, hey, do you realize this is the assumption that you're making? And is that really what you think you want to be doing? And do that in a non-threatening way. I think that's really important. And then I think the third thing that I try to do is really connect the reality of what's going on with the possible actions a company might take. So, there's lots of people running around saying, oh my God, the sky is falling, this and that. But then, okay, but what do you do about that? And I think having the ability to really put it into practical, tool-based, on-the-ground, action is really critical.
Oh, for sure. And one of your big chapters is how innovation proficiency can, you call it defang the organizational antibodies. And I love that term, organizational antibodies. Can you give us a little idea of where you're going with that whole thesis?
So organizational antibodies exist for a reason. They're there because executing against a proven business model requires consistent, repeatable, scalable process. And that requires, you can't have everybody in the company coming in and suddenly deciding, oh, we're going to do it radically different today, So I think the first observation I would make is you need to have respect for the fact that to keep a large enterprise moving along, it requires a certain level of discipline and continuity. At the same time, if you want to do something new, all those things that you're doing to sort of depress variability and to make sure things are handled consistently, et cetera, all those things get in the way. So I think the first recognition is that there is a set of processes that make a lot of sense when you're executing against a proven business model. Those are different processes when you want to discover a new business model. So I think that's the first big distinction. Secondly, I think once you recognize that, is understanding that the two things require discipline, but that they're different disciplines. So when I talk about innovation proficiency, I talk about the recognition that governance is required, that culture has to be open to doing new things, that you need resource allocation in terms of talent and management, and that it is a process that can be made much more systematic. So when you have high levels of innovation proficiency, your innovation doesn't depend on one champion or one person saying, oh, I think this is a great idea. It's sort of embedded in the fabric of how we do things around here. And that's a really different model than just saying we're going to execute like crazy against something we know how to do.
So it's really a couple different parts. You said that there's a governance culture and a resource allocation to it, that if you have a highly proficient organization at this, they have the multiple layers to it. Is there usually a leader, a primary leader? If you found that there has to be someone pretty high up in the organization that is in charge of innovation, or do you find it's better working it as it kind of decentralized in different business lines?
Well, that's a function of how related the innovations are to your existing business. So if you're starting from square one, right? So in my innovation proficiency scale has 7 levels, where, square one would be, I'm the post office, or I'm a, a government regulated utility. My job is 99.9% execution. I really don't do innovation. That's a separate challenge than a company that's moved along on the innovation maturity scale. So to get innovation going from a standing start, you really do need a senior champion. I just have not seen any examples where it happens without that. As you move up the maturity scale, though, what becomes interesting is that the leadership of innovation can become a lot more distributed. And so at really high levels of innovation proficiency, you still need senior level support. It's hard to make it happen if your senior people aren't behind it. But what you find is it's not so completely dependent on one or two people being the champion and pushing it forward. It's more embedded in the structures of the institution.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see how that, as you climb up that scale that you're referring to, I can see how that it starts with that senior leader, but then I see it can build musculature. It's almost like you're learning a brand new skill and then learning how to do it proficiently. Exactly. How do you take the academic approach? Like, when would you actually take it into a customer and say, would you actually, here's what we've come up with, would you actually buy it? And would you buy it for 1,000? Would you buy it for 5,000? Like, who's actually, in what stage do you actually bring it to the market and say, would you buy this if it were on the market?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't phrase it that way. I think what you want to do is get increasing evidence of customer desire and acceptance.
Okay.
So a great example of someone who does this really well is Alberto de Savoia, who wrote a great book. It's called The Right It. And in that book, he talks about a concept he calls pretotyping. And one of the ideas he has is he calls it an innovation readiness caliper. And he looks at the kinds of evidence of customer desire that you gather, beginning with 0, which is somebody said, oh, yeah, I'd definitely buy that, through to much stronger. You get more points for somebody that clicks on a website and says, yes, I'd like more information. You get a lot of points if somebody says, I'll give you my credit card, please send it to me. So there's a lot of ways of testing an idea that have varying degrees of robustness in terms of the proof that that idea is actually desirable. So, for example, if you put up a website that says, hey, do you have this problem? Click here for more information. And people start clicking on it. That gives you more information than just talking to somebody and saying, here's my thing, but what do you think? So what you want to do is get data about actual behavior.
I see. So you said Alberto, what was Alberto's last name?
De Savoia.
And the name of the book was called The Right It? Uh-huh. Oh, okay. So from a digital enterprise, you're saying you could put up a website and test related to that. What about physical? Like when companies are taking bets, where have you? Because what we were talking yesterday about the digital leaders going in actually into the field and meeting with customers, mm-hmm. And you have a whole chapter talking not about that concept necessarily, but I would love for you to know when when you actually have to prove your new model, and like what level of proof do you need to have at the edge before it becomes actually a part of you can actually introduce it into the core of the company to try to scale it?
Yeah, well, I think you want to have something people will pay money for, right? So I think if you start with, and today, it's so easy to do prototypes, right? Prototypes, wireframes, whatever. I think what you're looking for is that visceral, emotional, oh, I really want that kind of reaction from customers. And, today you can A/B test things. You can have, smoke tests where you put up a website or whatever and say, hey, if this thing existed, what would you buy it? So there's a lot of different ways of getting to proof point. So I'll give a specific example. Take something like Crest's Spin Brush, which was a toothbrush innovation introduced a couple of decades ago now.
Okay.
But basically the concept was we're going to make a toothbrush that has the functionality of an electric toothbrush, which was priced at about $50, at the price point of a high-end manual toothbrush, which was priced at about $10. And so among the tests that they did was, the entrepreneur behind this thing took over an aisle at the local Walmart for a weekend. It happened to be a buddy of his that owned that particular Walmart, and put a bunch of prototype toothbrushes in the store and watched what customers did. And they loved it. And that gave them the confidence that this was something people actually would walk into a store, take off the shelf, and pay good money for. And so at that point, you can then take the thing further.
I love that story. That's a great way to explain that concept. I just find it endlessly interesting how, because there's a certain bravado that came from Jobs that I think we hold him up as this mythic figure, probably rightfully so. But in some respects, he was quite an interesting person in the sense that he never had focus groups, or at least he said he didn't. And he said, if I asked the customer what they want, I wouldn't have been able to create something brand new. And this, I think even Ford did the same thing with the car, that if I asked someone what they wanted, I would have gotten a faster horse or something like that. And it's like, how do you make innovations not so that it's an extraordinary endeavor or person and make it more, not egalitarian, but you can spread out. It seems like there's higher risk when you just push it onto an individual.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I agree. So one of the core, I think, ideas there is something I read about in the book, which was an idea that Clayton Christensen made very popular, which is you've got to think about the job a customer is trying to get done. And one of the big mistakes companies make is they start with what they do and innovate outward. So, I make widgets, and therefore let's look at the market for widgets and the total addressable widget market and blah, blah, blah. And they frame the world in terms of what they do. And instead, if you frame the world in terms of what are the outcomes your customer is trying to achieve, what are the jobs they want to get done in their lives, it opens up your mind to completely new possibilities. And, people always talk about Steve Jobs as this incredible innovator, but it's important to remember Apple never did leading edge technology, at least since he came back in 1997. They never were innovating technologically. They took technology that kind of worked, was already available in the world, and thought about what's the thing customers want to get done more than anything else, and then designed their innovations around that.
Interesting. I think it's just so important to get out of the Steve Jobs mindset, as your point is made, because you can get stuck there, and I think it's debilitating for people. And when you say clarity of purpose versus strategy, is there a difference in your mind that is important for listeners to understand related to clarity of a purpose versus clarity of strategy?
Well, I think they go together, right? I mean, your purpose really relates to what it is you're trying to accomplish, and your strategy is really how you're going to get there.
So when I was reading in your book about Nadella, and he said his overall goal for the company was 100. Basically, how does he find deep meaning in work? And there's essentially there's a quest. But it seems to me that from your point about culture, is it possible to take a company that has you're trying to retain the existing revenue streams within an organization and then build in these new revenue streams on top of that? So you're trying to take care of the existing. It's like trying to change the tires on a moving car. And have you found that the ability to be entrepreneurial, or that kind of a company trying to find the people that have entrepreneurial tendencies within an organization, do they have to be separate from the organization from a strategy perspective so you can protect the core while you're building up brand new?
Well, different ventures, different organizations do it any number of different ways. I think the core really is thinking about how much interdependence is there between what you're trying to accomplish with the new venture and what the existing company is able to do. So if you think about it, as an existing business that's trying to innovate, if all you're doing is creating a separate entity that's doing something completely new and it has no relationship with your core business, well, you're no different or no better than a startup at that point. So the only reason that you want to leverage what you can do as a core, as an existing establishment, is because something about what you know how to do, some capability, some routine, is going to give you an advantage relative to a startup. Because don't forget, an existing company always has legacy, right? So you're already handicapped in the startup world in the sense that you've got processes. You can't create an advantage out of those, then you're no better off than a startup. So I would say the thing that makes a corporate venture better than a startup is leveraging something about the secret sauce of what you know how to do. Now, that could be customer relationships, that could be brand, that could be technology, that could be any number of things. So in the book, I talk about the metal services company Klockner. And what Klockner basically said was, look, we've made our money in steel for decades by basically selling steel products. And that model is going to give way to a much more value-added services model. And in that services model business, if we can digitize the steel supply chain, what we'll have an advantage of doing is leveraging the decades and decades of deep expertise we have in the core company. And that's what's going to give us actual customer value and make us differentiated from what any old startup could do.
That's because of this deep intellectual property value. Is that what you're saying? That
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they have people who've been working in steel and fabric metal, in Germany for decades, right? And so it's going to be impossible for a startup to match that.
Is there a time and place when you say seeing around corners that it's a bridge too far and that the company would need to look at acquisitions? Like, is there a way to gauge where you've seen around the corner and the corner is a precipice and it's the best idea would be is that a part of corporate decision-making now that you see as a part of the innovation conversation?
Oh, absolutely. I think there are times when it makes it a lot of sense to acquire. Building something from scratch takes time and it's very unpredictable and you are uncertain as to whether it's really going to work out. So if you are under a time pressure and you need to make something happen quickly, then an acquisition may be your best route. So I think that's super important to bear in mind. So, the make, build, buy, borrow, partner decision is really a function of timing, a function of how critical you think building this capability could be, and a function of whether you think you've got the DNA to make it happen. An interesting example there would be, Walmart has known that it's got to develop digital capability for decades. This is not a new thing. And it's tried and tried and tried and tried. And the DNA of the core business just really pushed back and resisted. And so what Walmart ended up doing was making a massive acquisition of a company called Jet.com, which was founded by a guy named Mark Laurie, who that I think was his third venture. So he had founded, right after college, a company called Diapers.com, which actually took on Amazon and was acquired by Amazon. He worked for Amazon for a couple of years. He and Jeff Bezos didn't see eye to eye. He left, founded Jet.com, this purely digital buying sort of company, and then into a meeting of the ways with Walmart. And basically it was in what people call an acqui-hire. I made the acquisition, but I did it so I could acquire this talent. And he is now running Walmart's digital division, which it's not profitable yet, but they're generating pretty decent revenue. And it's really injecting a whole new kind of DNA into the parent company. So that's an example of an acquisition where your goal really is to shift mindset and culture as much as it is to acquire a new way of doing business.
Yeah, it's interesting. The pond in the forest that doesn't get the new, it might be a great pond to support a lot of life, but if it's not getting that inflow of the fresh water, it essentially will stagnate. So it's interesting how, I actually love the Walmart story that you just talked about because it does show, especially in the very competitive retail space, how a big behemoth, it can make very important shifts to take on a digital competitor like Amazon.
I think we're at a very interesting inflection point with this whole physical retail versus digital. I think you're going to start to see newspaper headlines about, the return of physical bricks and mortar retailing, because digital's great, but there are things digital doesn't do well. If you want to understand look and feel, if you want to experience the essence of the thing, a brown box that shows up on your doorstep doesn't generally do as good a job of that as an environment where you can go and experience different things. So, for example, in New York, there's an interesting retail concept called Showfields.
Showfields?
Showfields, which is a retail store. It's 4 floors down in Soho. Very cool. And what Showfields founders have speculated is that there are these niche brands that don't have the resources to open up their own store, but that would like some kind of physical presence so people can go and experience what they have to offer and try things out. And interestingly, for a retailer, they've got another hypothesis, which is, so let's say I've got kitchenware and I've got makeup and I've got cool little electronic thing and I do a bike. Well, guess what? There is a certain kind of shopper who would be the right target market for all of those products. And so rather than having them compete with each other, the concept is let's make synergy by having a whole shop full of goods that might appeal to a certain kind of customer segment. And so rather than competing with each other, we're actually complementary. That I think is a really interesting retail concept.
Rita, it's interesting that you brought that up, because isn't that the way, our experience with buying cars? They lump all the car dealers together and they're all competing manufacturers, but they're all within like a mile of each other or even closer.
Right, I know. That's always astonished me how they kind of go in clumps.
Yeah. But to your point, though, it's funny from a human behavior perspective. That's worked there. Why not try to get that working in a different angle, what you just explained? I now understand where you're going with retail and potentially what can emerge there. Do you think it's these shifts that we're going through? Essentially, I always come back to when the horse-drawn carriage. It's funny if you look at old pictures in the early 1900s of New York City. Mostly horses are down the streets and commerce going back and forth with horses. And then within a 10-year shift, all of a sudden it was mostly cars that were flowing. And you got to wonder, the horse breeders and all of the accoutrements that go with running a horse downtown and the waste delivery and removal and all that all got disrupted, but it was replaced with something else. And I'm wondering, as we go through a lot of these shifts, do you think within organizations and kind of culturally, do you think that it's going to all play itself out in a positive way versus the kind of negative media angle that we generally are listening to?
Well, if you take a 30,000-foot level, the human beings have never had it better. There are fewer people in poverty, fewer people that are food insecure. Despite all the draconian headlines, the human race has got it pretty good at the moment. So I'm fundamentally an optimist. Yes, there are negative warning signs and there are things that one would like to do better. But as a general rule, innovation creates more prosperity for more people when looked at in the long run. Now, I think part of what we don't do well, and I'll speak specifically to American society, what we don't do well is the kinds of innovations that benefit a lot of people a little bit, but negatively affect a few people a lot. And I'm thinking here of globalization, right? So you shut down a manufacturing plant in Tennessee, and, globally, yeah, it's better for many people that's happening. But that local community is very much affected in a negative way. And I think that we haven't figured out how to deal with those kinds of displacement effects very, very effectively.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's very much like the human body in some respects, the interconnection, even though we got a cut on our hand, that's fairly insignificant in the sense that it's not going to get infected. It's not going to take us down, but it's deep enough and it's bothersome enough that it affects, our typing, ability to lift objects, grab a cup of coffee. It just affects us and we feel it for a couple of days, but it doesn't take the whole human body down. And then there's gradual impacts. And it's funny, a change, some part of the globe or in a community does have an impact, and it can be large or small. And it's funny, not funny, but it's interesting how these changes and the more connected we are, there's a general connectedness that is very similar. I look at like a living, breathing organism of impacts.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as we wrap up, there's a chapter that I found very, very interesting in seeing around corners in your own life. And there's a reason you picked that to wrap up your book. And I don't want to give away all the clues that to the people that can go out and buy the book. But generally, I'd like to know, and have you share with the audience, what were you thinking related to the last chapter as far as being able to, because we've been talking about the organization and sort of talking about an organization is different than talking about your own ability to see around corners in your own life. And I'd love for you to spend a couple minutes just talking about that as we start to wrap up.
Well, one of the reasons I thought it was important to have a personal chapter was organizations are collections of people. We talk about them as though they're this separate thing, but they're really not, And to the extent that our readers are missing inflection points, I think that's a very potentially negative thing. So the reason I wanted to have a chapter on personal inflection points was any decision that you make as a leader or a member of an organization is going to be related in part to where you come from as a person. So as an example, Satya Nadella at Microsoft attributes the fact that he had a severely disabled son to his ability to be empathetic and to his drive to have that empathy for customers and for each other and for team members as a key part of his management style. So you can't really divorce the person from the leadership. And so one of the things that I talk about in the last chapter is using inflection points almost the way the Apollo 13 used the gravity of the moon. So, the mission got in trouble and the conventional wisdom would have been, well, let's just fire up the engines and try to get back as quickly as we can. So try to get back to safety, as it were. And unfortunately, that wouldn't have worked. So it's attributed to a graduate student, what they worked out was, if in fact, instead of trying to avoid the inflection point, you accelerated toward it, and you kind of did a boomerang around the moon, you could actually use the moon's gravity to give you greater acceleration. And that proved to be the maneuver that eventually got the astronauts home safely. And I think if you think about that in terms of your own life, an inflection point can give you that extra momentum to move to the next step if you look at it openly and embrace it. And one of the activities I talk about in the last chapter is really doing almost a introspective look at where you want your future self to be. So write an article from the future about yourself and have that inform the decisions that you make today.
I think that's so powerful. I really think that many folks, just a short time ago, just a generation ago, 20, 25 years ago, if you were in your 40s and 50s, you're getting ready at the end of your career. And a lot of the folks now, it's like with longer life expectancies and longer time at work, it's like many people need to reboot their whole approach to work, especially if you've been in the workforce, 10, 15, 20 years. And I can't agree with you more on the need to have that introspection. I think you can't expect innovation to come out of you if you're not actually really applying that to your own life.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely. And I would add one other thing is that, we've not taken into account the real inflection point that is represented by the massive move of women into the workforce. And, we've built organizations for the people that lived in them. And historically, those tended to be white males, at least in Western society. And so what we're seeing now is the very first realization that for women, our careers are totally different in terms of pattern and rhythm than a men's career would be because of, it's just a different way of living life. And so I think what I'm seeing is a lot of women in their 50s, even their 60s, are just, it's like, it's our turn. We're going like gangbusters. And it's a whole new kind of career pattern.
Oh, I had never really thought of it from that angle. That is really interesting. We're having a Women in Innovation event coming up in the spring, and I'm not saying this from I don't believe women are victims in technology, that they're underrepresented. I just mean that the leaders that I run into that are women as leaders in technology are exponentially better leaders than the men. And I don't know why that is the case, but they literally run circles around the men. And even though they might only be 10, 15, 20 maybe 25% of the total population, just by definition, you're going to have that representative group is going to be better. And I don't know why that's the case, but, and it's not my field of study, but we're going to have an innovation event because I just think that I get invigorated talking about the women in innovation just because of, I don't know what it is, but there's probably people out there studying this, but that they're just able to affect change at scale better, easier. It comes more natural and it's not so much of a struggle, and they just demonstrate it. One of the interesting women that I'm interviewing on the podcast, just a quick story, she won the Orby Awards down in the DC area recently. And I find this theme, they tackle any challenge that is presented. There's no like limits. One of the themes I've just observed is that they're asked to do some things that are career changing and they tackle them. There's no like pause. There's no second guessing. They just jump right in. And even though it might seem insurmountable, it might seem a stretch, and I don't know what that is, and maybe you have a comment or two on that.
Well, there's a really interesting book out with the title something like Why So Many Incompetent Men, and a very interesting thesis that the author puts forward is that as we select people for leadership roles, we mix up confidence with competence. And I would argue that for a lot of women who are incredibly competent leaders, but they just don't sort of do the, chest thumping, I'm the best, blah, 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 kind of self-promotion stuff that a lot of men do. And so the men get the nod because they are out there sort of strutting their peacock feathers, and the women who are actually better don't. And so you've got this really, I think, interesting dynamic where incredibly competent leaders are overlooked because they don't do the self-promotional work that less competent leaders do. So that's one. The second thing I would observe is if you look at studies of how women lead, and you'll see comments like, they're very collaborative and they build horizontal connections and they empower people and they support people and give feedback and just go down the list. And now what we're realizing is that's what we're looking for in leaders in general. So in a way, women's leadership historically is what we're looking for all leaders to be like today. So I think you've got this very interesting moment where we're starting to recognize that what we're looking for in leadership is and I can't tell you why, we don't know whether it's nature, nurture, whatever it is, but women tend to be very good at empowering teams and letting people take credit for their work and creating psychologically safe workspaces. All those things, women tend to be better at that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like the Industrial Revolution, just in the span of humanity, is really quite a blip in how long we've been on the planet as a species, and we've survived through that selection process. And it's interesting. We're just focused on the Industrial Revolution as a one little 100, 200 year marker. But as that's changing with the digitization of everything, it's interesting how the kind of native skills that are generation upon generation deep in women probably will start to rise up big time. It's interesting. It's a really interesting conversation.
Well, thank you.
Well, Rita, this has been fantastic. And I mean, this just endless writing that you've done in this book, Seeing Around Corners. I love the title, How to Spot Inflection Points in Business. I highly recommend it to our listeners. And I'm going to put your links to it to be able to review it and your other work on the podcast show notes. But as we wrap up, is there anything that you were just dying for me to ask you, or a final comment that you're like, what, I got to leave with any particular message?
Well, I think some resources for your listeners. So I have a website, which is very creatively called ritamcgrath.com. And I publish a monthly newsletter. And what I do in the newsletter is I take a sector of the economy that I think is ripe for going through some kind of inflection point and, write about it. And so it's one of my ways of trying to stay fresh. So it's free. You can subscribe. You just go to my website and put your name and email in, and you get it once a month in your inbox. So that's another resource. And then also on the website, we have access to videos and lots of other content if you're interested in digging deeper.
Oh, that's fantastic. So ritamcgrath.com, and I'll put that up as a resource on the show notes page. And Again, this is a pleasure talking to you, Rita. It's been a lot of fun, and hopefully we can do a round 2 in the future.
That'd be great. Well, lovely to chat with your audience.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks. Bye.
So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously, and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.